Epilepsy warning for flashing lights and colors.
From 1971 to 1994, Disney's Magic Kingdom was home to Snow White's Adventures, a ride considered to be not only the scariest Disney ride, but the scariest dark ride of all time. But why was this ride built, and what are the details behind it? Let's go on a deep dive into the most infamous Disney ride ever, right here on Theme Park Crazy. Now for this video, we'll be doing a deep dive into Magic Kingdom's original Snow White Dark Ride. And as you'll see later on, a similar attraction still exists at Tokyo Disneyland. And speaking of Japan, this video's sponsor Klook wants you to help set up your dream trip to the country. Klook is the ultimate platform for booking incredible travel experiences. Their website and app are super easy to use, supporting multiple languages and over 40 currencies, so you can browse and book with confidence. Plus, their prices are some of the best around, and they constantly roll out discounts and special promotions. That way, you can save big on must-see attractions. And speaking of savings, Klook's annual Cherry Blossom campaign is happening right now, offering 50% off hundreds of tours and attractions across Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Whether you want to see the sakura in full bloom or dive into unique cultural experiences, Klook has everything in one place. Even better, you can stack my exclusive promo code ThemeParkCrazy for an extra 10% off most bookings, including those already discounted for the Cherry Blossom season. So what are you waiting for? Click on the link in the description, download the Klook app, and start planning your ultimate adventure today. Special thanks to Klook for sponsoring this video. In order to properly analyze this ride, it's crucial that we take a look at the film that inspired it. If you've already seen the movie, I'll leave a timestamp in the description below to skip to. Now let's rewind all the way back to 1937, when Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was first released in theaters. Based on the 19th century German fairy tale, this was Disney's first ever animated feature film. The movie centers around a young princess named Snow White. Her stepmother, known colloquially as the Evil Queen, becomes insanely jealous of her beauty after the Queen's magic mirror tells her she's no longer the fairest of them all. This was even after the Queen attempted to make Snow White less pretty by dressing her in rags and having her work as a scullery maid. After witnessing the prince fall in love with Snow White, the Queen plans to bump off her stepdaughter. She orders a huntsman to bring her Snow White's heart in a box. However, he can't bring himself to kill Snow White and confesses that the Queen is trying to kill her. He tells her to flee into the woods and never return, while giving a pig's heart to the Queen instead. Snow White, overwhelmed by this alarming new information, suddenly finds herself inside a dark and terrifying forest. She fantasizes the trees as monsters and even discarded wood as crocodiles. Eventually, she's led by her woodland critter friends into a dirty cottage in the woods. Thinking that orphans live there, Snow White decides to clean the cottage and cook for them. However, she's surprised to find out that the cottage is actually home to 7 dwarves who work in a diamond mine. Doc, Grumpy, Happy, Sleepy, Sneezy, Bashful, and Dopey. At first, they completely freak out, thinking Snow White is an intruder in their home. But after they get introduced to each other, Snow White decides to cook and clean for them, thinking the Queen won't find her there. But the Queen does indeed find out where Snow White is and that she's still alive, thanks to her magic mirror. Furious that the huntsman tricked her, she decides that if you want something done, you'll have to do it yourself. Since she also happens to be a witch, she uses a potion to disguise herself as a peddler and trick Snow White into eating a poisoned apple. Technically, the apple itself isn't meant to kill Snow White, but rather put her under an internal sleeping spell, with the only way to wake her up being true love's first kiss. The Queen's goal is that the dwarves will think Snow White is dead and bury her alive, a fate worse than being killed by the apple itself. After tricking Snow White into thinking the apple is actually a wishing apple, the plan is a rousing success. However, soon after incapacitating Snow White, the Queen is chased by the dwarves to the edge of a cliff. The Queen attempts to squash the dwarves with a giant boulder a la Mario Party 3, but is struck by lightning and falls off the cliff instead, with the boulder crushing her like garlic cloves for my world-famous garlic bread. The dwarves are absolutely devastated by the apparent death of Snow White, but in the classic Disney death trope, she is indeed brought back to life with true love's first kiss. Thanks to the prince, the spell is undone, everyone is ecstatic, and the queen is dead. He and Snow White ride off into the sunset, living happily ever after. The film was an instant success at the box office and is widely regarded as one of the greatest and most influential movies of all time. It made Disney the juggernaut it is today, and it still holds up as a classic fairy tale. Decades after the film's release, Walt Disney was looking for new rides for his Disneyland theme park. From the beginning, Walt wanted the new attractions to predominantly feature the characters from his famous feature films in his new park. Snow White, being one of the company's most successful projects, was naturally on the list for making a ride out of. For this project, Imagineer Ken Anderson, who served as art director of the original Snow White film, was put in charge of the new ride's artwork. Meanwhile, Imagineer Bill Martin designed the ride's layout, and manufacturer Aero Development designed the ride vehicles. According to Disney historian and former Imagineer Alastair Dallas, Walt Disney was heavily inspired by old pretzel-style dark rides. In particular, Walt was especially intrigued by the Haunted Castle dark ride at Los Angeles, California's Beverly Park. Walt was, quote, fascinated by the mixture of terror and joy on children's faces as their electric vehicles crashed through the exit doors. For the Snow White dark ride, it was agreed not to shy away from the film's darker aspects and go all out on making the ride frightening to capture the same reactions as the Haunted Castle. The attraction would be known as Snow White and Her Adventures, and it would take guests into the film through the titular character's perspective. After passing through the Seven Dwarfs diamond mine, passengers made their way into the Queen's castle, where she was crafting the poison apple. Next was the scene where Snow White flees through the forest, terrifying trees and all. Finally, the Queen, still in her disguise, attempts to push a giant boulder onto passengers just like in the film. Only this time, she's trying to push it onto Snow White instead of the dwarfs. It was then implied with a sound effect that the Queen met the same fate she did in the movie. After guests passed through a couple of doors underneath the boulder, the ride came to a sudden end. Though it was simple by today's standards, the ride was extremely advanced for the mid-1900s. Its detailed sets, handcrafted figures, and advanced storytelling would help set the standard for dark rides to come. That said, although it was clearly based on scenes from the movie, there are several key differences and a few continuity errors. In the beginning, guests follow a sign that leads to the witch's castle. In the movie, it's clear that the dwarves already know that the queen is evil. Grumpy even refers to her as an old witch, so it makes sense that a sign by their cottage would refer to her as such. But what doesn't make sense is why guests, playing the role of Snow White, would willingly head in the direction of the queen's castle. More so, by the time Snow White meets the dwarves, she's aware that the queen is trying to kill her. And Snow White never visits the queen's dungeon in the film. Also, Snow White's escape through the forest happens before she meets the dwarves. And she certainly wouldn't have seen the queen trying to crush her with a boulder considering she was incapacitated at the time. All of these changes were likely made to condense the ride's story and make it more suitable for a scary dark ride. The biggest complaint guests had, aside from how terrifying the ride was for children, was the absence of Snow White herself. According to E-Ticket magazine, Ken Anderson said of this complaint, quote, "One thing we intended was that everybody on the ride would understand that they were Snow White. As you rode the attraction, you were taking Snow White's place. You were the girl who was being threatened, and nobody got it. Nobody actually figured out that they were Snow White. They just wondered where the hell Snow White was." Eventually, the ride was changed in 1983 to predominantly feature the titular character. 5 years after Walt's death in 1966, Disney would open an all-new theme park resort in Orlando, Florida. With it came an all-new Disneyland-inspired park named the Magic Kingdom and an all-new Snow White dark ride along with it. But although the Disneyland version wasn't exactly a peaceful walk in the park, the one in Florida would crank up the horror to 11. The design of this new attraction would be led by Imagineer and Disney animator Claude Coates. Coates had previously served as a background artist on the original Snow White film, and he would work on a large number of Disney films and attractions throughout his career. He's known for working on Disneyland rides such as Pirates of the Caribbean, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, and the Haunted Mansion. According to Passport to Dreams, Coates was known for his textured landscape features and distorted perspectives. In the case of this new Snow White dark ride, he used his style to make it as terrifying as possible. This new ride, known simply as Snow White's Adventures, seemed unassuming at first. In fact, the start of the ride was flat out warm and welcoming. Guests circled the wishing well from the beginning of the movie, while a rendition of Snow White's I'm Wishing song played in the background. Still, just like in the movie, the evil queen stared menacingly from the balcony. Once again, Snow White is nowhere to be seen, and the goal is to put guests in her shoes. Immediately after the opening scene, guests enter the queen's castle. In this case, it makes more sense than in the Disneyland version, as immediately after the wishing well scene, Snow White is unaware of her stepmother's plan. In the queen's chambers, she appears to be staring into her magic mirror, but in the first terrifying jump scare, she turns around to reveal herself in her peddler's disguise. This moment of the ride was done with two figures in the same pose. This gave the illusion that there was a mirror on the wall when there was actually a hole in it. After this startling moment, guests enter the queen's dungeon, where talking, chained-up skeletons warn them to go back. One of these skeletons is a direct throwback to perhaps the darkest scene in the film. In one scene, it's implied that the queen taunted a prisoner in her dungeon by starving him to death with water just out of reach. She says, "Have a drink," and kicks the pitcher towards the lifeless bones, laughing evilly. The other skeleton that hangs by its arms is actually a nod to a deleted scene from the movie where the prince is tied up and interrogated in the queen's dungeon. Guests then come across the queen crafting the poison apple. And in this scene, you can see the actual ingredients for the apple, such as Black of Night and Scream of Fright. Exiting the castle, the queen would suddenly pop out of her secret passageway on a boat, offering Snow White to take a bite of the apple. Unlike in the movie, Snow White doesn't take the bait, and it's implied that she knows that the apple is poisoned. This leads into the escape into the woods from early in the film. Since the ride is from Snow White's perspective, guests also see the trees and logs as monsters. Just imagine being a kid and having these faces pop out in front of you. Suffice to say, Claude Coates did an incredible job at conveying the chaotic horror of this scene. And all the while, you can hear the queen's cackling laughter. Once guests escape the forest, they come across the dwarves' cottage. In the film, this served as a reprieve from the dark woods and a safe haven for Snow White. But here, the horror only continues. Because after entering the cottage, passengers were met with extremely unsettling houseware. The houseware is actually pretty accurate to the film, as we have both the water pump and the chair. But here, the ride twists the designs from quirky to foreboding, with looks of terror on their faces. Turning the corner, guests see horrified woodland critters and the only appearance of the 7 dwarves. This is yet another scene lifted from the movie and flipped around on its side. In the movie, the dwarves think there's an intruder in their cottage and send Dopey upstairs to investigate. At this point, Dopey thinks he sees a ghost when it's actually just Snow White stirring in bed, as she's exhausted from cooking and cleaning. On the ride though, there appears to be an actual ghost at the top of the stairs, with Snow White being at the bottom. A shadowy figure appears shaped like a ghost, though in this promotional image of the ride, it takes the shape of a horned demon. In the movie, Sneezy actually asks Dopey if the quote-unquote monster has horns, to which Dopey motions that it does. That said, I'm unsure if those are supposed to be horns or if those are just eye holes and the scenery cropping the top off just makes it look like there are horns there. In another jump scare, the queen suddenly appears at a window, offering the apple once again. I've seen a lot of people comment something like, "Imagine getting stuck," on old videos of the ride. But there's no need to imagine it, because in one clip of the ride, passengers do actually get stuck there.
May I have your attention? Please remain seated. This ride has stopped temporarily and will resume motion at any time. Please remain seated for your own safety. Thank you.
Now that's some grade A nightmare fuel. From here, Snow White runs back out into the forest, where the queen yet again slides in with the apple. Fun fact, the queen's hand in this scene was made from the same mold as the ones from the nearby haunted mansion. Guests then take a right turn into the dwarves' mine, and at this point, the queen is done with the whole apple plan. Impatient, she decides to try and cave in the mine altogether. First, she tries to run you over with a minecart. Then, the grand finale. The queen has ditched her boulder in favor of a more expensive giant diamond. With an evil laugh, she shrieks, "Goodbye, dearie," and then riders are brought into what's known as the strobe room. Here, there are flashing lights, starburst shapes, and the Queen's echoing cackle heard in the background. It is implied that the Queen has indeed crushed Snow White with the giant diamond. Now you may be wondering, what on earth were they thinking? What happened to Happily Ever After? For years, these have been the big questions with this ride. Sure, there was a sign outside of the ride warning parents of how scary it was, but let's be real, how many Disney World guests actually bothered to read the signs? One major rumor that has circulated over the years is that Claude Coates intentionally made this ride as scary as possible as a middle finger to upper management. Apparently, he had a darker vision for the Haunted Mansion in mind that was rejected in favor of a more lighthearted ride. And so to vent his frustration, Coates made the Snow White ride intentionally horrifying. In reality, there's no evidence to back this theory up, and Coates sadly passed away in 1992, so there's no way to ask him. Honestly, it sounds more like one of those cliched lost episode creepypastas than something that actually happened. But we do have a basic explanation as to why the ride was as scary as it ended up being. In an interview with Disney historian Didier Guez, legendary Imagineer Tony Baxter commented on why the ride was so horrifying. He said, quote, "I remember when the assignment came, they said they wanted one ride to be beautiful, that was Peter Pan, one to be funny and silly, that was Mr. Toad, and one ride to be scary, which was Snow White. So we made it scary. Many people said it was more frightening than the Haunted Mansion because it was witches all of the time." So as it turns out, the ride was indeed meant to be intentionally scary in order to give more variety to Fantasyland's attractions. Walt also reportedly wanted the same variety for Disneyland's Fantasyland. You might be thinking, if this is the case, then why was the ride given such a brutal, tragic ending? Most likely, the main goal of the ride was to take creative liberties with the story in order to make it more intense. There are plenty of dark, frightening moments in the original film, and the ride designers clearly chose to focus on them. It's not hard to imagine that a happily ever after ending would come across as abrupt and clash with the ride's tone. Nowadays, we either have straightforward retellings of the story or joyful epilogues that lack conflict. Back then, though, Imagineers weren't afraid to mix things up a bit with the original story to fit a certain mood. Just look at Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. Instead of going to jail like he does in the movie, Mr. Toad runs into an oncoming train and goes to hell. It's morbid and nothing like the movie, but way more exciting and memorable, and either way, Mr. Toad gets his comeuppance for driving recklessly. Looking back, many praise the ride for daring to do something different, and some even suggest that the film's lack of availability at the time gave Imagineers more freedom to change up the plot. As longtime WD Magic forum user Animaniac9398 put it, relying too much on guests' detailed knowledge of the events of a movie can be a hindrance on the ride if they are unfamiliar. When Snow White's Adventure opened in 1971, it was near impossible to see the Snow White movie in its entirety. Disney only re-released the movie to theaters once every 7 years on average, refusing to sell such an important movie and cash cow on video or show it on television beyond select clips. The original design team took advantage of this by creating a nightmare of an attraction deliberately removed from the original. Unfortunately, the ride's fear factor also made it a target for angry parents. And after decades of visits to guest services, the ride was refurbished and greatly changed in 1994. According to Eyes and Ears, the exclusive newsletter for Disney cast members, officials noted that, quote, "More guests complain about Snow White's adventures than any other Disney theme park attraction." The article also noted how the refurbishment was meant to increase capacity as well. For the most part, the ride's frightening nature and constant complaints from parents did indeed contribute to its closing. The new version, ironically renamed Snow White's Scary Adventures, was much less frightening. On this new ride, Snow White herself is prominently featured and shows up at several points in the layout. Though some frightening elements were still kept, the ride veers greatly from the original in the second half. Instead of terrified houseware, guests are met with the dwarves happily playing music when they enter the cottage. Turning the corner, you do get to see the frightened animals and water pump, but instead of the original's jump scare, there was a scene of Snow White accepting the apple from the queen. After this is the scene where the dwarves flee the diamond mine to chase after the queen. Like in the movie, the queen tries and fails to crush the dwarves with a large rock. In the end, the prince wakes up Snow White from the sleeping spell and they live happily ever after. This version of the ride was far less scary than the original, and it didn't have anywhere close to the same panicked atmosphere. In the original, the Queen's laughter was heard pretty much throughout the entire layout. Also, the dim lighting throughout really made it scarier. Here though, there is some levity sprinkled in there. It's more accurate to the movie, but it can't top the terror of the original ride. This version would operate all the way until 2012 when it too was removed. It was replaced by a princess meet and greet, and later on, the Seven Dwarfs Mine Train would serve as the new Snow White attraction. Believe it or not, there is still a Snow White ride that's fairly close to the 1971 Magic Kingdom version. This ride, also named Snow White's Adventures, retains many elements from the original Florida edition. These include the runaway minecart, the dungeon, the trees, and the Queen popping out every now and then. Though in this version, the dwarves' cottage is still a reprieve, and it ends with the Queen failing to crush them with a boulder. Once again, it's nowhere near as horrifying as the original, but it's still worth visiting. In the end, Snow White's Adventures at Magic Kingdom remains one of the most infamous dark rides in Disney history. Not only that, but it's perhaps one of the most terrifying dark rides ever. Claude Coates did a phenomenal job immersing guests in a twisted version of the story where they experience Snow White's terror firsthand. Modern Disney attractions have largely moved away from such intense scares, and the original Snow White's Adventures stands as a reminder of its time. A time when Disney wasn't afraid to push the envelope, even if it meant traumatizing a generation of kids. So what do you think? Did you get to ride the original? Let me know in the comments. And speaking of comments, now it's time for the comment shoutout program. This is where I take 5 random comments from my previous video and read them out. These comments come from my video on the Jaws ride incident. Lizzie Gween says, I love the movies, but I didn't go on the ride until not long before it shut down and I only did it once. I swore at the shark when it jump scared me. I'm glad I rode it, but I probably wouldn't again if I was still there. Matt112389 says, Bro, the one that was in Florida scared the life out of me in the barn part of the ride. I was having none of it, LMAO. Naughty Smurf 64 says, I went there in 1990, rides Jaws and Kong were down for repair except the earthquake ride. I wonder if I got there right after this happened, super disappointed, didn't go back for 30 years. Key Aria 14 says, LMFAO, I was terrified hearing that the shark had real teeth. I couldn't imagine falling in with that thing in the water. My brain would have convinced me it was real. As a kid, I was scared to swim in the pool after watching the version of Jaws with LL Cool J. I was wholeheartedly convinced a shark would get me. That movie gave me my fear of sharks. Anthony Tuchilo 6274 says, that shark looked pretty realistic. Looks like it got a downgrade afterwards. If you want to see your words in my next video, leave a comment down below and it may be selected. Please note though that inflammatory or spam comments will not be read. Thank you all so much, and if you want to support me on Patreon, you can do so once again at the link in the description.
Thanks for watching, everyone. Feel free to like, share, and subscribe. You can follow me on social media on Instagram and Facebook, or you can check out my website at themeparkcrazy.com.
And I'm on TikTok.
This is Theme Park Crazy, and I'll see you all next time.